Enlil's name appears on thousands of ancient tablets scattered across museums worldwide. King of the gods, Lord of the wind, ruler of the space between heaven and earth. But among all the hymns praising his power and myths recounting his deeds, certain texts stand apart. They don't celebrate Enlil's strength. They don't tell stories of cosmic battles or divine romance. Instead, they record his instructions. Specific, detailed procedural instructions on how humanity should organize itself, govern cities, practice agriculture, preserve knowledge, and maintain cosmic order. Not suggestions, not philosophical musings. Instructions presented as decrees from the Enlil's mountain temple at Nippur, transmitted through kings, priests, and scribes who saw themselves not as inventors of civilization, but as its receivers. These are the teachings the title speaks of, hidden not because scholars have suppressed them, but because their implications have been overlooked in plain sight. What if the Sumerian tablets preserved not mythology, but memory? What if Enlil's role was never to create humanity, but to teach it how to function after creation? What if civilization as we know it, cities, kingship, agriculture, writing, law wasn't discovered through millennia of trial and error, but transmitted as a complete system? The tablets suggest exactly this. Comment below where you're watching from and what time it is. Whether it's midnight or midday, you're about to encounter evidence that challenges the standard narrative of human cultural evolution. Evidence written in humanity's oldest script, preserved in clay that has survived longer than any empire, translated by scholars who sometimes struggle to explain what they're reading. Let's begin with what we can hold in our hands. Physical artifacts, verified translations, academic consensus, and the questions it cannot answer. CBS 10673 sits in climate-controlled storage at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. The tablet is smaller than your palm, its surface covered in wedge-shaped impressions that catch the light at certain angles. Fired clay, pale brown, heavy with age. 4,000 years beneath Mesopotamian soil before excavators brought it to the surface at Nippur in the late 19th century. This particular tablet contains what scholars call the Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian account of creation, early cities, and the Great Flood. But what makes this text remarkable isn't the flood story itself, which parallels accounts found across cultures. What matters is how the text frames the origin of human civilization. It describes kingship as something that descended from heaven, cities as places where divine ordinances were established before human populations grew, agriculture and animal husbandry as arts that were bestowed, not developed. The text uses a specific Sumerian term repeatedly, Gaza, the divine ordinances, the proper procedures established by the Anunnaki and transmitted to humanity through intermediaries. Enlil appears at the center of this transmission, not as creator. That role belongs to other deities in the pantheon, but as the authority who decrees what must be, the one who holds the tablet of destinies, the judge who determines legitimate kingship, the source from whom instructions flow. This isn't one tablet speaking. It's a pattern that emerges across hundreds of texts excavated from Nippur, Uruk, and other Sumerian sites. Instructions presented as received wisdom. Knowledge described as transmitted from divine source to human practitioner. Civilization framed not as invention, but as inheritance. The mainstream interpretation treats this as religious metaphor. Ancient peoples attributing their own innovations to gods as a way of lending them authority. Standard mythology, standard cultural evolution, disguised in theological language. But the texts themselves resist this interpretation at every turn. The level of specific detail, the procedural precision, the emphasis on exact transmission and preservation, the absence of origin myths explaining how techniques were discovered or developed. Instead, again and again, this is how it was shown to us. This is how it was decreed. This is the teaching from the Iker. What follows isn't a claim that ancient aliens visited Mesopotamia. It isn't pseudo-archaeology or fringe speculation. It's an investigation of what the Sumerian tablets actually say about the origin and transmission of their knowledge, examined through the lens of Enlil's specific role as teacher, judge, and authority. We'll look at the tablets themselves, the archaeological context of their discovery, the translation process that allows us to read them, the mainstream scholarly interpretation, the details that interpretation struggles to address, and the possibility raised by the texts themselves that civilization might be something humanity was taught to follow rather than something it invented through experiment. The evidence exists. The translations are published. The tablets sit in museum collections where anyone can request to see them. What remains hidden isn't the texts, but the questions they raise about instruction, authority, and the origin of organized human society. Let's examine what the Anunnaki king Enlil's ancient teachings actually were, and what it might mean if the Sumerians were recording something more than myth. Before the cities rose, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates wasn't always home to civilization. For millennia, it was marshland and river plain, seasonally flooded, difficult to inhabit year-round. Hunter-gatherer populations moved through the region, following game and seasonal plant resources, leaving behind stone tools and temporary campsites, but no permanent settlements. Then, sometime around 400–500 BCE, something changed. Not gradually, not through the slow accumulation of innovations we typically associate with cultural evolution. Within a few centuries, an eye blink in archaeological time, southern Mesopotamia transformed from scattered settlements into organized cities with complex irrigation systems, monumental architecture, sophisticated administration, and the world's first writing system. Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Nippur, Lagash, cities that shouldn't exist according to the standard model of how urban civilization develops. The infrastructure alone presents a puzzle. Canal systems that required coordinated labor from thousands of workers. Ziggurats demanding precise engineering and resource management. Temple complexes built to architectural plans that show consistency across generations, suggesting transmitted knowledge rather than experimental development. The Sumerians appeared in history already possessing the skills that other civilizations took millennia to develop. Scholars acknowledge this puzzle while attempting to explain it through accelerated development, lost predecessor cultures, or environmental factors that forced rapid adaptation. But the archaeological record remains stubbornly sparse for the transitional period. We have scattered Ubaid villages, then suddenly we have Sumerian cities with all the infrastructure already in place. The Sumerians themselves offered a different explanation. They said civilization came to them, that it was lowered from heaven, that before the cities there was instruction, that the Anunnaki, the great gods, descended from An, the sky, and Ki, the earth, established the principles by which human society would function, then transmitted those principles through chosen intermediaries. Enlil, according to the texts, held central authority in this transmission. His temple at Nippur served as what the Sumerians called the bond between heaven and earth, the axis point where divine decree met human implementation. Kings travelled to Nippur not to conquer it, but to receive legitimacy. Scribes trained there to preserve the exact forms of knowledge. Priests performed rituals following procedures they claimed originated at the Ikur, Enlil's mountain house. This wasn't unique to one text or one period. The pattern appears consistently across Sumerian literature spanning more than a millennium. The instructions of Shuruppak, dated to around 2600 BCE, explicitly frames wisdom as something transmitted from father to son, traced back to before the flood. The Sumerian king list, compiled around 2000 BCE, states directly that kingship descended from heaven and was granted by Enlil to successive cities. The farmer's instructions presents agricultural knowledge not as developed technique, but as received teaching, using the same terminology found in religious texts describing divine decrees. The Sumerians didn't claim they invented writing, they said it was given to them. They didn't claim they discovered how to organize large-scale irrigation, they said they were taught. They didn't claim they developed the concept of kingship it through social evolution. They said it descended from heaven and was conferred by Enlil upon chosen rulers. Modern archaeology treats these claims as foundation myths, the way cultures legitimize their institutions by attributing them to divine origin. Every civilization does this to some degree. The Egyptian pharaoh claimed descent from Ra. Chinese emperors held the mandate of heaven. Mesoamerican rulers traced authority to Quetzalcoatl. It's standard practice for emerging states to wrap their power structures in theological language. But the Sumerian texts do something unusual with this pattern. They don't just claim divine origin. They provide detailed accounts of transmission mechanisms. They name specific individuals who received instruction. They describe the physical locations where teaching occurred. They preserve the actual content of the instructions in procedural detail. They emphasize exact preservation and accurate transmission as sacred duties. This level of specificity creates interpretive problems. If these are simple foundation myths, why the obsessive concern with procedural accuracy? Why the detailed descriptions of how knowledge moved from divine source through intermediary channels to human practitioners? Why the emphasis on preservation rather than innovation, on maintaining traditional forms rather than developing new ones? The archaeological context deepens the puzzle. Nippur, Enlil's city, was never a political capital. It never dominated other cities through military force. Yet every Sumerian ruler sought legitimacy there. Excavations at the site revealed not palaces or fortifications, but temples, libraries, and scribal schools. The city's primary function was preservation and transmission of knowledge. More than 30,000 cuneiform tablets were recovered from Nippur during excavations between 1889 and 1900. Then again, in the mid-20th century, the majority weren't administrative records or economic documents. They were literary texts, hymns, prayers, wisdom literature, educational materials, the largest collection of Sumerian literature ever found, all concentrated at the site. The Sumerians themselves identified as the source of legitimate instruction. The tablets show something remarkable about how knowledge was treated. Student copies preserved mistakes alongside correct versions, suggesting teaching methods focused on exact replication. Literary compositions appeared in multiple copies with minimal variation across centuries, indicating systematic preservation efforts. Technical texts presented procedures in step-by-step format without explaining developmental process or experimental method. The entire educational system seemed designed not to encourage innovation, but to maintain transmitted forms with precision. This is the context in which we must understand Enlil's teachings, not as vague mythological claims of divine guidance, but as a specific system the Sumerians believed transmitted civilization's foundations, a system centered at Nippur, a system associated with Enlil's authority, a system that treated knowledge as something received and preserved rather than discovered and developed. Before we examine specific texts containing Enlil's instructions, we need to understand how we can read them at all. The tablets sat buried for thousands of years. The language was forgotten. The script became indecipherable. When 19th century excavators began pulling clay tablets from Mesopotamian tells, they had no idea what the wedge-shaped marks meant. The story of how cuneiform was deciphered reveals something important about the reliability of what we're about to examine. These aren't speculative interpretations of ambiguous symbols. They're translations of a script we can read with the same confidence we read Latin or ancient Greek. That decipherment and what it revealed about Sumerian views on knowledge transmission is where we turn next. The language of heaven and earth. The wedge-shaped marks seemed like decorative patterns at first. When European travelers began visiting Mesopotamian ruins in the 17th and 18th centuries, they sketched the strange impressions they found on stone monuments and scattered bricks, but couldn't conceive they were looking at writing. The marks were too regular to be random, yet too geometric to be recognizable letters. The breakthrough came in 1835 when Henry Rawlinson, a British officer stationed in Persia, began copying an inscription carved into a cliff face at Behistun. The monument featured the same text in 3 different scripts: Old Persian, Elamite, and what would prove to be Akkadian written in cuneiform. Old Persian was partially understood. By comparing the three versions, scholars could begin to crack the code. By the 1850s, Cuneiform could be read well enough to translate Akkadian texts, the Semitic language of Assyria and Babylonia. But beneath the Akkadian, archaeologists kept finding older tablets in a different language entirely, a language with no known relatives, a language that appeared fully formed with sophisticated grammar and extensive vocabulary, then gradually faded from use, even as the cuneiform script it had invented continued for millennia. Sumerian. The decipherment of Sumerian took decades longer than Akkadian because there were no bilingual inscriptions to serve as Rosetta Stones. Scholars had to reconstruct the language through painstaking comparison of thousands of texts, identifying repeated patterns, isolating grammatical markers, building vocabulary lists from context. By the early 20th century, Sumerian could be read with reasonable confidence. By the 1960s, computer-assisted analysis and the compilation of comprehensive dictionaries made translation increasingly reliable. Today, we can read Sumerian texts with approximately the same confidence we read ancient Egyptian or biblical Hebrew. Grammar is well understood. Vocabulary is extensively documented. Ambiguities exist, particularly with rare words or damaged passages, but the core meaning of most texts is clear. This matters because of what those texts say about themselves. The Sumerians had a term for their written language, emegir, the princely tongue, or the noble speech. They distinguished it from eme, sao, a dialectical variation used in certain religious contexts, and from the Akkadian language, increasingly spoken by later Mesopotamian populations. But emegir itself, they claimed, was the language given to humanity for the preservation of divine knowledge. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, compiled by the University of Oxford, now provides free access to translations of nearly 400 Sumerian literary compositions. These aren't fringe interpretations, they're the work of multiple scholars at major universities, peer-reviewed and cross-checked against the cuneiform originals, available for anyone to examine. What becomes clear when reading these translations is how consistently Sumerian literature frames knowledge transmission. The text, designated ETCSL 495. 1. Enlil in the Ika, known as Enlil. A opens with a description of Enlil's temple at Nippur, but it doesn't describe the temple as a building humans constructed to honor a god. Instead, it presents the Eka as the place where heaven and earth are bound together, where the divine plans are perfected, where the great fates are decided. The text states, Enlil, when you marked out the holy settlements, you also built Nippur, your own city. You founded the Kir, your lofty residence. You built it up in place of the Eka, the mountain, the great bond of heaven and earth you set up. The language is architectural, but it describes something more than construction. It speaks of marking out, founding, establishing as patterns. The Ika appears in multiple texts, not merely as Enlil's residence, but as a template. The mountain house that defines what sacred space should be, which earthly structures then replicate. This pattern of replication rather than innovation appears throughout Sumerian literature. The farmer's instructions, catalogued as ETCSL 563, provides extraordinarily detailed procedures for agricultural work. Every step is specified: when to flood fields, how to plough repeatedly in specific patterns, what depth to sow seed, how to protect shoots from birds, when to harvest, how to store grain. The level of precision suggests transmitted technical knowledge, yet the text never mentions development or discovery. Instead, it presents the instructions as established procedure, the proper way farming must be done. Similarly, the instructions of Shurupak, ETCSL 561, opens with a specific transmission formula. Shurupak gave instructions to his son Jusudra. The text dates to around 2600 BCE, making it one of humanity's oldest wisdom literature compositions. But its framework isn't exploratory or philosophical. It's instructional. Do this, don't do that, follow these procedures. The wisdom isn't presented as Shurupak's personal insights developed through experience, but as teaching he's transmitting to his son in an unbroken chain. The Sumerian education system mirrored this emphasis on preservation and exact transmission. Excavations at Nippur revealed an entire quarter dedicated to scribal training, the Eduba tablet house. Thousands of practice tablets show student scribes copying literary texts, mathematical tables, sign lists, and model letters. The teaching method focused on replication. Students copied exemplars created by master scribes. They practiced until their copies matched the original. Innovation wasn't encouraged. Accuracy was everything. Why this obsession with exact preservation? The texts themselves provide an answer, though it's an answer that creates interpretive challenges. They claim the knowledge being preserved originated from divine instruction, that it was given to humanity through specific channels at specific moments in the past. That alteration or innovation risked corrupting transmitted wisdom that humanity hadn't developed and therefore couldn't replace. The Sumerian king list demonstrates this logic at its most explicit. The composition exists in multiple versions found at different sites across Mesopotamia, all showing remarkable consistency despite being copied centuries apart. The list begins, after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, not after kingship developed or after kingship emerged. Descended from heaven. The Sumerian term Nam-Lugal means specifically the institution of kingship, the office, the authority, the legitimate exercise of rule. The text claims this institution came from above, was granted to Eridu, then transferred to other cities as Enlil decreed. Each transfer is framed as a divine decision. Eridu was defeated, and its kingship was carried to Bad Tibira, then to Larak, then to Sippar, then to Shurupak. Then the flood came. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. The pattern holds constant. Kingship doesn't develop independently in each city. It descends once from heaven, then moves between cities by divine decree. Enlil, as the god who holds the tablet of destinies and determines fates, appears in associated texts as the authority making these transfers. This creates a historical puzzle. The king list includes both mythical and historical kings mixed together. Early rulers are credited with impossibly long reigns, tens of thousands of years. Later kings have realistic reign lengths that match other historical records. Scholars identify the historical section as beginning around 2600 BCE, where archaeological evidence confirms many of the kings and dynasties listed, but the text makes no distinction between mythical and historical sections. It treats the entire sequence as continuous, as if the same system of divine legitimation that operated before the flood continued operating afterward, as if Enlil's authority to confer kingship remained constant across whatever transition the flood represented. This is where translations matter. We're not reading vague claims filtered through multiple translations and cultural interpretations. We're reading specific Sumerian statements that have clear grammatical structure and unambiguous vocabulary. When the text says kingship descended Eid, it uses a verb with concrete physical meaning. When it says Enlil decrees Gaza Gar, it uses terminology that appears in legal and administrative texts with procedural implications. The texts resist metaphorical interpretation. They present their claims as factual statements about how institutions originated and legitimate authority is conferred. What Enlil's specific role was in this system, how the Sumerians understood his authority, and the nature of his teachings requires examining texts that focus directly on his nature and function. Not hymns praising his power in general terms, but compositions that describe what he does and how he does it. We turn now to the texts that identify Enlil himself, his domain, his symbols of authority, and his specific function as the one who decrees fates and confers legitimate order to the cosmos. Lord of the Mountain House, Enlil's titles tell a story before we read a single myth. Nun, Amnir, Lord who fills the princely office. Enkur, Ker, Ra, Lord of all lands. Lugal, Ker, Ra, King of all countries. Great mountain, Father of the gods, Lord of the storm, Bearer of the Tablet of Destinies. These aren't poetic epithets chosen randomly. Each reflects a specific aspect of function and authority within the Sumerian understanding of cosmic order. The most revealing title appears repeatedly across texts: Great Mountain. In a flat river plain where the highest natural elevation might be a few meters, the metaphor carried specific meaning. Mountains represented permanence, immovability, the foundation that couldn't be shaken. Enlil, as Great Mountain, embodied unchanging cosmic law, the fixed point against which all else was measured. His temple name reinforced this: Eka, mountain house. Not temple, not palace, mountain house. The structure at Nippur that housed Enlil's presence was understood as an earthly manifestation of the cosmic mountain, the axis connecting heaven, earth and underworld. Excavations at Nippur between 1889 and 1900 located the Eka complex in the city's center. The ziggurat alone covered thousands of square meters, rising in stepped tiers toward the sky. But the temple proper, the structure at the ziggurat summit, was modest in size. This wasn't a palace for earthly luxury. Archaeological evidence suggests it functioned primarily for ritual purposes, the place where priests performed ceremonies the Sumerians believed maintained cosmic order. The hymn Enlil in the Eka, our text ETCSL 405. 1 describes the temple's cosmic function: the Eka, the lapis lazuli house, the lofty dwelling place, inspiring great awe, whose holy rites cannot be seen through, a mountain where abundance overflows. The good house, the house of decrees, the place where the gods assemble, the great place, the pure place. The language combines architectural description with functional definition. The Ekur is simultaneously physical structure and cosmic institution. It's where decrees happen, where divine will translates into ordered reality. Another passage in the same hymn specifies Enlil's unique authority. Enlil, when you marked out the holy settlements, you also built Nippur, your own city. You founded the Kir, your own place of residence. You gave the word, and it came into being. The platform was raised up, filled with well-being. You have positioned within it your throne of light. The sequence matters. Word precedes reality. Enlil speaks, and what he speaks comes into being. This isn't metaphorical language in the Sumerian conceptual framework. It's how they understood cosmic causation. The divine word, the decree, the Gaza structures reality. Enlil holds authority to speak that word. This brings us to the Tablet of Destinies. Multiple texts reference this object, always as a physical thing that can be held, stolen, or transferred. The Sumerian term dub namtara breaks down as tablet, dub, of fate's destinies, namtar. Not a metaphorical concept, but described as an actual tablet, inscribed with cuneiform, impressed with cylinder seals, functioning as a legal document that conferred supreme authority. The mythology surrounding this tablet reveals Sumerian understanding of legitimate power. In the Akkadian period, myth known as the Anzu epic, the bird demon Anzu steals the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil while he bathes. Immediately, cosmic order begins to collapse. Without the tablet, Enlil's decrees carry no weight. Authority evaporates. The gods must recover the tablet and return it to Enlil for order to be restored. The story treats the tablet not as symbol, but as mechanism. Authority doesn't flow from Enlil's inherent nature, but from his possession of this specific object. The tablet makes legitimate whoever holds it. That legitimacy allows their word to structure reality, to make decrees that must be followed because the cosmic order itself enforces them. This understanding of authority, as transmitted through specific objects and procedures rather than inherent in bloodline or force, appears throughout Sumerian political theology. Kings didn't claim power through strength or birthright alone. They required confirmation from Enlil, granted through ritual at Nippur, often represented by receiving physical symbols of authority. The practical implications shaped Mesopotamian history. history for millennia. Even when Akkadian kings conquered Sumerian cities in the late 3rd millennium BCE, they traveled to Nippur to receive legitimacy from Enlil's temple. Even when Babylon became the dominant power in the 2nd millennium, Babylonian kings maintained Enlil's cult at Nippur and sought confirmation there. Political power could be seized through force, but legitimate authority, the kind that allowed stable rule and commanded voluntary obedience, required Enlil's endorsement. This wasn't superstition operating independent of political reality. It was political reality. A king who controlled armies but lacked Enlil's confirmation faced constant rebellion. A king who received confirmation from Nippur could rule with minimal force because subjects accepted his authority as legitimate. The texts describe this system as established intentionally, as taught, as instructions from Enlil about how human governance should function. Kingship descended from heaven, but it descended as a complete system with rules, procedures, and requirements. Follow the procedures, receive legitimacy. Violate the procedures, lose legitimacy even if you retain power. This brings us to the specific instructions the text attribute to Enlil. Not vague moral wisdom, but precise procedural knowledge about how to organize society, maintain order, and preserve civilization across generations. The instructions of Shuruppak presents itself as exactly this kind of transmitted procedural knowledge. The text's framework, father instructing his son, appears in other ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature, but the Sumerian version does something unusual. It traces the teaching back before the flood. Shuruppak, the father, is identified as the king of the city of Shuruppak immediately before the Great Deluge. Jusudra, the son, is the flood survivor who preserved humanity and knowledge through catastrophe. The teaching isn't Shurupak's personal philosophy. It's presented as wisdom. Shuruppak is transmitting wisdom that predates him, wisdom that must survive the flood because civilization itself depends on preserving these instructions. The content mixes ethical guidance with practical procedures. Some passages feel familiar. Don't speak arrogantly to your mother. Don't make a judgment when you've been drinking beer. Universal wisdom that appears across cultures. But other passages are oddly specific. You should not buy a donkey that brays. It will split your earnings. You should not plow a field on a road. You should not drive away a powerful man. The instructions assume complex social structures, commercial transactions, agricultural systems, hierarchical authority, the full infrastructure of urban civilization. What makes this significant is the dating. The instructions of Shuruppak exists in copies from multiple periods, the earliest from around 2600 BCE. Only a few centuries after Sumerian civilization first appears in the archaeological record, yet the text presents its wisdom as already ancient, as transmitted knowledge that predates even the civilization using it. This same pattern appears in the farmer's instructions. The text catalogued as ETC SL 5. 6. 3. Provides step-by-step procedures for successful agriculture in southern Mesopotamia's challenging environment, but it never mentions discovery or innovation. Instead, after you cut the weeds and establish the limits of the field, level it repeatedly with a thin hoe weighing 2/3 of a mina. The precision is remarkable. Not just level the field, but specific tool weight. Repeated leveling established field boundaries first. Every step follows in proper sequence with technical specifications that suggest this isn't advice developed through personal experience, but transmitted procedures proven effective across generations. The text continues with this level of detail through the entire agricultural cycle. When to flood fields, how many times to plow, what depth to plant seed, how to protect crops from birds, when to harvest based on precise observation of grain maturity, how to store crops to prevent spoilage. This is instruction manual material, the kind of knowledge you transmit to someone who needs to follow proven procedures without necessarily understanding why each step matters. Learn the process, follow it exactly. Results will follow. The Sumerian scribal education system, centered at Nippur, operated on these same principles. Excavations revealed the tablet houses. the Eduba, where young scribes trained for years in exact replication of model texts. The curriculum was rigid. Students copied sign lists until they mastered hundreds of cuneiform characters, then literary excerpts, then complete compositions, then mathematical tables, then legal formulas, then finally they were qualified to serve as professional scribes. Innovation wasn't part of the training. Creativity wasn't encouraged. The goal was to become a living vessel of transmitted knowledge, capable of reproducing exactly what previous generations had preserved. Why this emphasis on preservation over innovation? The texts themselves suggest an answer. If knowledge was received rather than discovered, if civilization's foundations were taught rather than developed, then alteration risks losing something humanity can't replace. Innovation becomes dangerous when you're preserving instructions from a source that understood principles you don't. This is where Enlil's specific function becomes clear. He wasn't described as the creator of humanity. That role belonged to Enki in most creation accounts. Enlil's function was to establish order, to decree fates, to determine legitimate authority, to maintain cosmic law. He was the administrator of civilization, the authority who ensured proper procedures were followed. His teachings, the instructions associated with his name and authority across Sumerian literature, weren't spiritual wisdom or philosophical insights. They were procedural knowledge. How to organize a state, how to confer legitimate kingship, how to structure society, how to maintain order across generations. The next question becomes, what was the specific content of these teachings? What did the Tablet of Destinies actually contain? What were the divine decrees, the Gaza that structured Sumerian civilization? To answer these questions, we need to examine texts that describe the Tablet of Destinies in functional terms and explore what the Sumerians meant by divine decrees, the tablets of destiny. The Sumerian term appears across hundreds of texts. Gaza, scholars translate it variously as divine ordinances, cosmic decrees, rites, proper procedures. No single English word captures the full meaning. The Gaza represented the established patterns that structured reality, how things should be done, how institutions should function, how cosmic order should manifest in earthly practice. Closely related was the concept of ME, sometimes written as ME. These were described as physical objects that could be transferred, stolen, or bestowed. The myth Inanna and Enki describes the goddess Inanna getting Enki drunk and persuading him to give her the MEs, which she then carries to her city Uruk. The text lists over 100 specific MEs: kingship, priesthood, truth, judgment, sexual intercourse, prostitution, music, victory, counsel, fear, weeping, the art of metalworking, the craft of the carpenter, the craft of leatherworking, the craft of the smith, the craft of the basket weaver. The MEs weren't abstract principles. They were described as objects Inanna loaded into her boat, physical things that, once transferred to Uruk, allowed that city to practice the crafts and maintain the institutions they represented. This materialization of knowledge, the idea that civilization's foundations existed as transferable objects containing essential information, runs throughout Sumerian thought. The Tablet of Destinies represented the master list, the supreme Gaza that made all other Gaza legitimate. Enlil's possession of this tablet wasn't accidental or arbitrary. The texts present it as his proper function within the divine hierarchy. An, the sky god, held supreme position as father of the gods, but An was distant, removed from active governance. Enlil, positioned between heaven and earth, held executive authority. He wielded the Tablet of Destinies as the mechanism through which divine will translated into cosmic order. When the Anzu epic describes Anzu stealing the tablet, the immediate consequence is paralysis of divine governance. The text states, he took away the Enlil functions. Suspended were the divine rights, and silence reigned. Suspended were the ordinances. The Akkadian term translated as Enlil functions is Enlil II, the activities that defined Enlil's role. Without the tablet, those functions ceased. Authority evaporated. Order began to collapse. This suggests the tablet wasn't merely symbolic of authority but functional in maintaining it, as if authority required not just power but proper procedure, and the tablet contained the procedures that made legitimate authority recognizable and binding. What exactly was written on this tablet? The texts never provide a complete inventory, but they describe its function. In legal contexts, cylinder seals impressed on clay tablets authenticated documents and made them legally binding. The Tablet of Destinies appears to have functioned similarly, but at cosmic scale. It was described as impressed with seals, inscribed with cuneiform, serving as a permanent legal document that conferred legitimate authority on whoever properly possessed it. The Sumerian understanding of how words and writing functioned illuminates this. Writing wasn't merely a record of speech, it was speech made permanent, capable of maintaining effect across distance and time. A decree written and sealed became law that could be enforced in the issuer's absence. The written word possessed power. The spoken word lacked because it persisted. The Tablet of Destinies in this framework represented permanent divine decree. The words spoken at creation, made permanent, still structuring reality because it was written down and properly sealed. As long as the tablet existed and remained in proper authority's hands, the cosmic order it decreed would continue functioning. This explains the obsessive Sumerian concern with proper transmission of written knowledge. If writing contained permanent power, if properly inscribed and sealed texts could structure reality, then exact preservation became critical. Alteration wasn't just disrespectful, it was dangerous. It risked corrupting the procedures that maintained order. The scribal schools at Nippur make sense in this context. They weren't merely training bureaucrats, they were preserving the written knowledge that structured civilization. The Ejuba produced scribes who could create legally binding documents, maintain temple records, copy sacred texts without error, transmit the Gaza across generations. The curriculum emphasized exact replication because exact replication was how power was preserved. A correctly copied royal decree carried the king's authority even in his absence. A correctly copied hymn to Enlil maintained its efficacy even if the original composer was long dead. The writing itself, if properly executed, contained the power it described. This understanding of written knowledge as power explains another curious feature of Sumerian literature. The texts rarely explain their reasoning or provide developmental context. Instead, they present procedures directly. Do this, then this, then this. Follow these steps and you'll achieve the proper result. The farmer's instructions never explains why you should level a field repeatedly with a hoe of specific weight. It simply states that you should. The instructions of Shurupak rarely justifies its advice. It lists procedures. Do this, avoid that, follow this pattern. The Sumerian king list doesn't explain how divine legitimation worked. It simply records the pattern. Kingship descends from heaven, transfers between cities by Enlil's decree, legitimizes those who receive it properly. This makes sense if the texts understood themselves as transmitting received instructions rather than explaining discovered principles. If knowledge came from divine source, the role of text was to preserve that knowledge accurately, not to analyze or develop it further. Understanding might come through practice and contemplation, but the text's job was preservation. The mainstream scholarly interpretation treats all this as religious ideology serving political purposes. Whoever controlled Nippur controlled legitimacy. Therefore, Nippur's priests promoted ideology that made their temple essential. Kings played along because it provided useful justification for their rule. The Tablet of Destinies was mythological construct. The Gaza were religious concepts, and the emphasis on divine instruction was standard ancient theocracy. This interpretation handles most of the evidence smoothly. Ancient peoples did attribute their institutions to divine origin. Ruling classes did use religion to legitimize power. Temple complexes did serve political functions. We see these patterns globally across ancient civilizations, but certain details resist this comfortable explanation. First, the consistency of transmission across centuries. Sumerian literature shows remarkable textual stability despite having no central authoritarian control enforcing orthodoxy. The same compositions appear at different cities, copied by different scribal traditions, showing minimal variation. This suggests something beyond political propaganda, perhaps genuine belief that exact preservation mattered. Second, the specific nature of Enlil's authority. Unlike divine kings in other cultures who claimed to be gods or descended from gods, Sumerian kings didn't claim to be Enlil. They claimed Enlil granted them legitimacy. The authority remained external to them, dependent on proper procedure. A king who violated the Gaza lost legitimacy even if he retained power. This seems an odd system to invent if you're trying to maximize kingly authority. Third, the technical precision in instruction texts. If the farmer's instructions were merely religious literature, why provide such specific procedural detail? If the goal was theological legitimation, vague references to divine agriculture blessing would suffice. Instead, we get measurement specifications, sequence instructions, observational criteria for timing decisions. Fourth, the peculiar treatment of innovation. Most civilizations celebrated their innovators and inventors. The Sumerians rarely mentioned innovation. Their literature consistently frames knowledge as transmitted tradition. This seems counterproductive if you're trying to glorify your culture. It would be more natural to claim our ancestors discovered all these techniques through genius and effort, rather than we receive this knowledge from divine instruction. These details don't prove the Sumerian account is literally accurate, but they do suggest the Sumerians genuinely believed they were preserving transmitted knowledge. The system wasn't cynical political manipulation. It was sincere attempt to maintain what they understood as received instruction about how civilization should function. What specific role did Enlil play in the Sumerian understanding of how legitimate authority was conferred and maintained? The answer requires examining the texts that describe how kingship functioned and what made a ruler legitimate in Sumerian eyes. When kingship descended from heaven, the clay prism sits in the Ashmolean Museum, Oxford, catalogued as WB 444. It's a small object, easily held in one hand, with text running in tight columns around all four sides. The composition inscribed on it, the Sumerian king list, exists in multiple versions found at different Mesopotamian sites, suggesting it was widely copied and served important function in Sumerian understanding of political legitimacy. The opening line establishes the framework. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, not emerged, not developed, descended. The Sumerian verb ed means to go down, to descend, to bring down from above. The text uses it with intentional precision. Kingship, the institution, the office, the legitimate authority to rule, came from above to below, from heaven to earth. The list then proceeds through a sequence of cities and rulers. Eridu holds kingship first. Its kings rule for fantastical periods, 23,000 years, 28,800 years. Then Eridu was defeated, and the kingship was carried to Bad Tibira. More kings with impossible reign lengths, then to Larak, then to Sippar, then to Shuruppak. Then comes the flood. Then the flood swept over. After the flood, the pattern continues. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. The verb is the same, descended. As if kingship needed to be re-lowered from heaven after the catastrophe that destroyed the previous world. From Kish, kingship transfers to Uruk, then to Ur, then back to Uruk, then to various cities across southern Mesopotamia. With each transfer, the text uses similar formulas. The previous city was defeated, or its kingship was carried to the next location. The pattern implies divine decision, not merely military conquest. Cities don't seize kingship through force. Kingship is transferred to them. The reign lengths shift from mythical to realistic around 2600 BCE, where archaeological evidence begins confirming many of the kings named. Gilgamesh appears in the list as 5th king of Uruk after the flood, ruling 126 years, still exaggerated but no longer in the thousands. Later kings have reign lengths that match other historical sources. The list transitions seamlessly from myth to history without signaling any shift in the underlying system. Scholars debate how to interpret this structure. Some see the pre-flood section as pure mythology, with the historical section beginning around 2600 BCE. Others suggest the long reign lengths might encode different calculation systems or represent dynasties rather than individuals. Still, others propose the entire structure serves political purposes, legitimizing whichever city compiled a particular version by placing it prominently in the sequence. But these interpretations must account for a curious feature. The king list was copied across Mesopotamia for over a millennium by city-states that often competed violently with each other. Why would rival cities preserve and transmit a document that legitimized each other's authority? Why not create competing king lists favoring their own cities? The answer seems to lie in the document's function. The king list wasn't propaganda for one city over another. It was a framework for understanding legitimate succession of political authority. According to this framework, only one city could hold supreme kingship at any given time, but which city varied according to divine will. Enlil determined the transfers. This created a system where military power could be distinguished from legitimate authority. A city might conquer others through force without acquiring legitimate kingship. Conversely, a weaker city might hold legitimate kingship even if stronger neighbors dominated militarily. The system required conquered cities to acknowledge the victor's legitimate authority, not just their superior force. Practically, this meant kings who conquered Sumerian cities had to travel to Nippur to receive Enlil's endorsement. The endorsement ceremony likely involved formal ritual at the Eka, recorded on temple documents, announced to other cities. Once granted, Enlil's endorsement made a king's rule legitimate throughout the Sumerian world. Without it, he remained a conqueror whose subjects might rebel at any opportunity. This system persisted even after Sumerian political power faded. When Sargon of Akkad conquered the Sumerian city-states around 2300 BCE, creating history's first territorial empire, he didn't eliminate the system. Instead, he was incorporated into it. Akkadian kings added their names to the kingship sequence, claimed Enlil's endorsement, maintained the cult at Nippur. The system absorbed them. Centuries later, when Hammurabi of Babylon emerged as the dominant Mesopotamian power around 1750 BCE, he likewise claimed Enlil had granted him kingship. His famous law code begins, "When lofty Anum, king of the Anunnaki, and Enlil, lord of heaven and earth, who determines the destinies of the land, determined for Marduk, the firstborn of Enki, the Enlil, functions over all mankind." Even though Hammurabi elevated Marduk as Babylon's patron deity, he still framed his authority in terms of Enlil's decree. Even though he ruled from Babylon, he still acknowledged Enlil's temple at Nippur. The system that began with the Sumerians continued structuring Mesopotamian political legitimacy for 2,000 years. What made this system so durable? One possibility is that it genuinely reflected Mesopotamian understanding of how authority worked. In modern political thought, we separate legitimate authority from raw power. A government with a legitimate mandate faces less resistance than one ruling purely through force. Mesopotamian political theology made this distinction explicit by attributing legitimacy to divine source, external to the ruler. This meant even absolute monarchs were subject to higher law. A king derived authority from Enlil, but that authority was conditional. It could be withdrawn if the king violated proper procedures, neglected his duties, or lost divine favor. Multiple Mesopotamian texts describe kings who lost legitimacy despite retaining military power, eventually falling to rivals who claimed Enlil had transferred kingship to them. The system encouraged even powerful rulers to maintain the institutions that legitimized. This meant supporting Nippur, maintaining its scribal schools, preserving its literary texts, funding its rituals. In this sense, the system was self-perpetuating. Those who benefited from it had incentive to maintain it, but this still doesn't fully explain the system's origin. The Sumerian king list claims kingship descended from heaven before any of the historical cities existed. It claims Enlil determined legitimate succession from the beginning. It claims the system was established rather than evolved. The texts associated with Enlil's teaching include specific instructions on how kingship should function. These appear in various compositions as royal hymns, prayers, and wisdom literature addressed to or spoken by legitimate kings. The content is surprisingly consistent across centuries. A king should maintain justice. He should protect the weak from the powerful. He should ensure proper worship of the gods. He should maintain and extend irrigation systems. He should build and repair temples. He should preserve traditional festivals. He should support scribal schools. He should maintain roads and trade routes. He should defend borders from outside threats. He should ensure fair weights and measures in commerce. These duties appear repeatedly in texts describing what Enlil expects from those to whom he grants kingship. They're presented not as suggestions, but as requirements. A king who performs these duties maintains legitimate authority. A king who neglects them risks losing Enlil's favor, and therefore his legitimate right to rule. This is precisely the content you'd expect if kingship descended as a complete institution with instructions attached. The duties aren't philosophical ideals about good governance. They're specific job requirements for maintaining the kingship office. The mainstream interpretation treats this as standard ancient Near Eastern royal ideology. Every culture developed expectations for rulers. The Mesopotamians framed theirs in theological language. The emphasis on divine instruction was a metaphorical way of expressing cultural values, but the alternative possibility remains present in the texts themselves. What if the Sumerians were accurately describing a system that was taught to them? What if kingship was a transmitted institution that came with specific instructions about how it should function? What if Enlil's role was not metaphorical, but represented whatever source provided those instructions? This doesn't require accepting that Enlil was a physical being who personally instructed early Sumerians, but it does raise questions about how such a comprehensive and durable political system emerged so quickly at civilization's beginning, then maintained remarkable consistency across millennia of historical change. Before examining that question further, we need to look at another category of Enlil's teachings: wisdom literature that claim to transmit practical knowledge for individual behavior and family life. These texts, particularly the instructions of Shurupak, present themselves as teaching that predates even the flood, preserved through catastrophe because civilization itself depended on maintaining these instructions. Instructions to a son. The text begins with a transmission formula. Shurupak gave instructions to his son Jusudra. The names carry significance. Shurupak was the last antediluvian city mentioned in the Sumerian king list. Jusudra was the flood hero, the Sumerian equivalent of Noah or Utnapishtim, the man who survived the deluge and preserved humanity. The framework establishes the stakes. These aren't casual observations from father to son. They're instructions that must survive the coming catastrophe. Knowledge. Jusudra needs to preserve as he preserves humanity itself. The text itself, known as the Instructions of Shurupak and catalogued as ETCSL 561, exists in copies from multiple periods spanning over 1,000 years. The earliest fragments date to around 2600 BCE, within centuries of when Sumerian civilization first appears in the archaeological record. Yet even these early versions present the wisdom as already ancient, as teaching transmitted from before the flood. The content mixes practical advice, ethical principles, and social guidance. My son, let me give you instructions. You should pay attention. You should not locate a field on a road. You should not plough a field at its boundaries. You should not boast in the beer house like a deceitful man. You should not vouch for someone. That man will have a hold on you. You should not select a wife during a festival. Her inside is illusory. Her outside is illusory. Some instructions feel universal advice that would make sense in any culture. Don't get drunk and make decisions. Don't speak arrogantly. Don't be hasty with strangers. Human wisdom that appears across civilizations, but other instructions are oddly specific to Sumerian cultural context. You should not buy a donkey that brays. It will split your earnings. You should not drive away a powerful man. You should not destroy a man who is in charge. The palace is a ox-eye trap. The palace is a slippery place. You should not wish for these things. These instructions assume complex urban society, commercial transactions involving donkeys, hierarchical power structures with powerful men and officials in charge, palaces that present both opportunity and danger, the full infrastructure of civilization. What's striking is that these instructions appear in a text ostensibly from before the flood, before the civilization they describe should exist. The mainstream interpretation resolves this by dating the instructions to whenever Sumerian civilization actually existed, treating the flood framework as literary device. The text was composed around 2600 BCE, projected backwards onto mythical figures to lend authority. But this explanation must account for how Sumerian civilization appeared so rapidly, with so little archaeological evidence of developmental stages. If the instructions reflect real social structures that had emerged by 2600 BCE, those structures appeared with remarkable speed. The advice assumes institutions, markets, hierarchies, legal systems, property rights, social classes that typically take centuries to develop, yet which seem present almost from the moment Sumerians appear in history. The alternative possibility is that the text's own framework describes something real, not necessarily a literal flood, but some kind of civilizational discontinuity, knowledge preserved from an earlier order and transmitted across some kind of break. The instructions presented as ancient because they actually were ancient relative to the civilization using them. This reading doesn't require accepting flood mythology as historical fact, but it does take seriously the text's repeated claim that it's transmitting received knowledge rather than presenting contemporary wisdom. Another section of the instructions reinforces this transmission emphasis. You should not speak arrogantly to your mother. That causes hatred for you. The mother, like Utu, gives birth to man. The man, like the earth, receives seed. You should not work using only your eyes. You will not multiply your possessions using only your mouth. The advice combines ethical guidance, respect your mother, with practical reality. Hard work matters more than appearances, and cosmic principle, mother as birth giver, parallels the sun god, Utu. The integration of these levels, practical, ethical, cosmic, suggests the text understands human behavior as part of ordered reality, not separate from it. This holistic view appears throughout Sumerian wisdom literature. Right behavior isn't just morally good, it aligns with cosmic order. Wrong behavior isn't just unethical, it disrupts proper functioning. The Gaza, the divine ordinances, applied to personal conduct as much as to political institutions or agricultural practice. If this was the Sumerian worldview, then teaching proper behavior wasn't merely socializing children. It was transmitting knowledge about how reality functioned. Knowledge that, if preserved correctly, would allow civilization to maintain order. Knowledge that, if lost or corrupted, would lead to civilizational collapse. The flood narrative embedded throughout Mesopotamian literature takes on additional meaning in this light. Multiple versions exist. The Sumerian Eridu Genesis, the Akkadian Atrahasis, Epic, the flood story in Gilgamesh, all describing catastrophic deluge that destroyed previous civilization. But the point of these narratives isn't the destruction, it's the preservation. In every version, someone receives instructions. In the Eridu Genesis, Ziusudra is warned by Enki. In Atrahasis, the hero Atrahasis received detailed boat-building instructions from Ai. In Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim describes the precise measurements and construction techniques given to him. The instructions are always specific. Build a boat of exact dimensions. Load it with breeding pairs. Seal it with pitch. Prepare for 7 days of storm. The level of detail suggests these aren't vague mythological memories, but transmitted technical knowledge about surviving catastrophe. After the flood, knowledge must be transmitted to the new world. The survivors become teachers. They pass on what was preserved, how to organize society, how to practice agriculture, how to maintain order. Civilization resumes not by rediscovering everything from scratch, but by implementing preserved instructions. This pattern, catastrophe, preservation through instruction, transmission to new generation, appears throughout Sumerian literature. It's not presented as unusual. It's the normal pattern of how knowledge moves through time. Teaching and exact preservation, not innovation and discovery. The instructions of Shuruppak embodies this pattern. The father teaches the son survives catastrophe. The teaching survives with him. Future generations receive the same instruction through unbroken transmission. If we take this pattern seriously as describing Sumerian self-understanding, then their emphasis on exact preservation makes perfect sense. They believed they were maintaining knowledge that had survived previous catastrophes. Knowledge that must be preserved exactly because it couldn't be rediscovered if lost. Knowledge about how civilization functions, received from sources that understood principles the current generation might not fully comprehend. Enlil's role in this system was maintaining the transmission itself. As holder of the Tablet of Destinies, as the authority who decreed proper order, his function was ensuring the Gaza remained intact, not creating new instructions, but enforcing the established ones, not adapting tradition but maintaining it across generations and through catastrophes. This brings us to another category of transmitted instruction, technical knowledge. The instructions of Shuruppak dealt with personal and social behavior, but other texts claim to transmit specific technical procedures, particularly in agriculture, the foundation of Sumerian civilization. These agricultural texts present some of the clearest examples of what Enlil's teachings actually meant in practical terms. The science of the furrow, the farmer's instructions, catalogued as ETCSL 5.6.3, reads like an operations manual. No philosophical preamble, no theological justification, just step-by-step procedures for successful agriculture in southern Mesopotamia's challenging environment. After you cut the weeds and establish the limits of the field, level it repeatedly with a thin hoe weighing 2/3 of a mina. The text specifies tool weight in precise units. A mina was approximately 500 grams, so 2/3 of a mina equals about 30 grams. This isn't use a light hoe, it's use a hoe weighing exactly this much. The precision suggests transmitted technical knowledge where specific parameters matter. The instructions continue with the same level of detail. Let the pickaxe wielder eradicate the ox hoofprints for you. Let the pickaxe wielder smooth them out for you. The deep ploughed areas and all the holes must be gone over for you with a drag and the surface made level. The concern is thorough field preparation. Every unevenness addressed. Multiple passes with different tools. The procedure takes time but ensures proper water distribution when the field is flooded. Then irrigation. When you are about to till your field, keep a sharp eye on the man who puts in the ditches. When you flood the field, the water should not rise too high in it. When the water is emptied out, watch the field's wet ground, for this is when it can develop white alkali or saltiness. The instructions address the specific challenge of Mesopotamian agriculture, salinization. Irrigated fields in hot climates accumulate salt through capillary action and evaporation. Too much water, left standing too long, and the field becomes sterile. The instructions show awareness of this problem and provide monitoring procedures to prevent it. The ploughing sequence follows. When you are about to plough your field, open the irrigation works so that the water does not rise too high in the field. When you have emptied it of water, watch the field's furrows. The furrows should be of equal width. Let the oxen drag the plowshare and let them trample the clods with their hoofs for you. Again, specific sequence, flood, drain at proper moment, ensure even furrows, use oxen to both pull plow and break clods. Each step serves purpose in the overall process. Then seeding, keep your eye on the man who puts the seed in. Let him drop the grain uniformly 2 fingers deep. Seed depth matters. Too shallow and birds eat it. Too deep and it fails to sprout. 2 fingers, approximately 3 centimeters, is the optimal depth for barley in Mesopotamian conditions. The instructions specify this precisely. The text continues through the entire growing season. How to protect emerging shoots from birds, when to water, how to recognize proper grain maturity, when to harvest, how to thresh, how to store. Every step includes specific observable criteria for decisions. Not vague, when the time is right, but when you see this particular condition, do this particular action. The level of detail suggests this is working knowledge refined through extensive practice or transmitted from source that understood the complete system. What's conspicuously absent from the text is any discussion of how these procedures were discovered or why they work. There's no developmental narrative. We tried various ploughing depths and found this one works best. There's no explanatory theory. The reason you plough twice is it's pure procedure. Do this, then this, then this. Results will follow. This style matches other Mesopotamian technical texts. Mathematical tablets present problem-solution pairs without explaining underlying principles. Medical texts list symptoms and treatments without discussing disease theory. Omen texts catalogue observed patterns without explaining causation. The Mesopotamians clearly had sophisticated understanding of mathematics, medicine, and empirical observation, but their texts don't present that understanding as discovered knowledge. Instead, they present it as transmitted procedure. Follow these steps, apply these formulas, perform these treatments. The knowledge works, and that's what matters. The mainstream interpretation sees this as simply how pre-scientific cultures operated. Without scientific method to test theories, ancient peoples relied on trial and error to develop practical techniques, then transmitted successful procedures without necessarily understanding why they worked. The farmer's instructions represents accumulated agricultural wisdom preserved in convenient instruction format. This explanation handles most of the evidence. Every agricultural society develops successful techniques through practice and passes them to the next generation. That's how cultural knowledge normally transmits. But certain details create interpretive tension. First, the sophistication of the procedures. The farmer's instructions addresses problems that take considerable time and observation to recognize. Salinization from over-irrigation, optimal seed depth for germination rates, timing of harvest relative to grain moisture content. These aren't things you learn in 1 or 2 seasons. They require systematic observation across many cycles. Yet the instructions appear in texts dated to the early Sumerian period, shortly after agriculture in this region begins leaving archaeological traces. The procedures seem remarkably refined for a newly established agricultural system. Second, the precision of the specifications, tool weights, seed depths, water levels, observable criteria for timing decisions. This level of precision suggests not just practical experience, but systematic measurement and documentation. Yet measurement systems themselves require institutional development, standardized units, trained observers, mechanisms for recording and transmitting specifications. Third, the absence of variation. If these procedures were developed independently by multiple farming communities through trial and error, we'd expect regional variation, different techniques emerging in different areas. But the farmer's instructions presents its procedures as universal truth, applicable throughout the Sumerian world. Fourth, the integration with other knowledge systems. The agricultural calendar referenced in various texts synchronizes with astronomical observation, religious festivals, and administrative taxation. Everything connects in a comprehensive system where agricultural, religious, political, and astronomical knowledge reinforce each other. These details don't prove supernatural origin, but they do suggest that Sumerian agriculture emerged as a fully developed system rather than evolving gradually from simpler practices. The instructions feel less like accumulated folk wisdom and more like technical knowledge transmitted from a source that understood the complete integrated system. This interpretation aligns with the Sumerian self-understanding. They didn't claim they developed agriculture. They claimed it was taught to them. The knowledge came from the Anunnaki, from Enlil, who decreed proper order, from Enki, who provided practical wisdom, from Nippur, who governed the agricultural cycle. The teaching happened at the beginning, before cities rose. Then it was preserved through scribal transmission. Generation after generation copied the farmer's instructions, maintaining the procedures exactly. Innovation wasn't encouraged because the transmitted knowledge already worked. Why risk altering procedures you don't fully understand when following them produces reliable results? This brings us to the institutions that preserved this transmitted knowledge: the scribal schools centered at Nippur, operating under Enlil's authority, training generation after generation of scribes in exact replication of traditional texts. These institutions, the Ejuba, the tablet houses, reveal how seriously the Sumerians took the preservation and transmission of knowledge. The House of Tablets. The excavations at Nippur between 1889 and 1900 uncovered an entire quarter devoted to scribal education. Not a single school building, but dozens of structures, each apparently functioning as a small academy where master scribes trained students. Archaeologists designated the area Tablet Hill for the sheer quantity of clay tablets recovered, more than 30,000 pieces, most of them educational materials. The tablets tell the story of how Sumerian scribes were trained. Beginners started with sign lists, cuneiform characters arranged by phonetic similarity, written repeatedly until muscle memory formed. Thousands of practice tablets survive, showing students copying the same signs over and over, their attempts becoming more confident across successive tablets. Then came word lists. Thousands of Sumerian nouns organized by semantic category: trees, birds, fish, tools, textiles, metals, stones, professions. Students copied these lists repeatedly, absorbing vocabulary while practicing sign formation. Then, short literary passages. Excerpts from hymns, myths, proverbs. Students copied model texts created by master scribes, attempting to replicate not just content but form, line breaks, column structure, spacing, overall aesthetic. Then complete compositions. Full hymns to various deities. Myths of creation and cosmic order, royal praise poetry, wisdom literature, gradually building toward professional competency. Advanced students copied mathematical tables, legal formulas, administrative documents, ritual procedures, the complete range of texts a professional scribe might need to produce. The entire curriculum emphasized replication over innovation. Students succeeded when their copies matched the exemplars. Accuracy was everything. Speed and artistic flourish came later, after fundamental competency was established. This educational approach reflected Sumerian understanding of what knowledge was and how it should be transmitted. Knowledge wasn't something individuals created. It was something civilization possessed collectively, maintained through institutions, transmitted across generations. A scribe's job was to become a reliable vessel for that transmitted knowledge. The Sumerian term for scribal school, Ejuba, literally meant tablet house, not house of learning or house of wisdom, but specifically house of tablets. The physical objects containing written knowledge were central. The institution existed to produce scribes who could create, read and preserve those tablets. Multiple composition about scribal education survive, describing daily life in the Ejuba. These texts mix humor and harsh reality. Students complain about beatings from teachers. They describe competitive hierarchy hierarchies among students. They express anxiety about pleasing the school father, the master scribe who ran each academy. But beneath the human drama, the texts reveal consistent educational philosophy. Success meant mastering transmitted tradition. The goal wasn't to become a creative thinker or innovative problem solver. It was to become a faithful transmitter of established knowledge. One text, known as The School Days, describes a student's experience. In the tablet house, the teacher recited my tablet to me. Then I wrote and showed my work to the school father. The process teacher provides exemplar. Student copies it. Master examines the copy. If acceptable, student advances. If not, student repeats until achieving acceptable accuracy. Another passage describes punishment. My headmaster read my tablet and said, "There is something missing," and caned me. Even small errors warranted punishment. The transmitted knowledge had to be preserved exactly. Missing even minor elements constituted failure. This strict approach might seem harsh by modern standards, but it made sense within Sumerian worldview. If knowledge came from divine instruction, if civilization's proper functioning depended on maintaining transmitted Gaza, then exact preservation became sacred duty. Errors weren't just mistakes. They were threats to cosmic order. The archaeological evidence confirms this attitude. Literary texts show remarkable consistency across centuries. The Instructions of Shuruppak appears in copies separated by hundreds of years, showing minimal variation. Hymns to Enlil and other gods maintain stable form across different cities. Mathematical procedures remain identical from Old Babylonian through Neo-Babylonian periods spanning more than a millennium. This textual stability required institutional commitment. Scribal schools had to maintain exemplar tablets. Master scribes had to enforce accuracy standards. Scribes across different cities had to share texts to prevent divergence. The entire system operated to prevent the gradual drift that naturally occurs when texts are copied repeatedly. Why this extraordinary effort to maintain stability? The Sumerian answer appears throughout the text we've been examining. Because the knowledge was received. Because it came from divine instruction. Because humanity's role was to preserve what had been taught, not to alter it according to shifting human understanding. Enlil's temple at Nippur served as the center of this preservation system. The city was never a political capital, never the seat of military power, but it was the scribal capital, the place where literary tradition was maintained most carefully, the source from which other cities obtained authoritative versions of texts. When kings conquered other cities, they still supported Nippur's scribal schools. When dynasties fell and political orders collapsed, Nippur's educational institutions continued functioning. The system transcended political change because its purpose transcended politics. It was maintaining civilization's foundation, the transmitted knowledge on which everything else depended. The mainstream interpretation sees this as cultural conservatism with religious justification. Scribal elites had vested interest in maintaining their specialized knowledge. By framing it as divine instruction that must be preserved exactly, they protected their professional monopoly. The emphasis on exact transmission served social and economic purposes for the scribal class. This explanation has merit. Professional groups do protect their specialized knowledge. Religious justifications do serve social functions. We see these patterns across cultures and historical periods. But this interpretation struggles with the content of what was being preserved. Much of Sumerian literature provided practical knowledge freely available to anyone who could read. The farmer's instructions wasn't secret scribal law, it was agricultural guidance meant for farmers. The Instructions of Shuruppak taught personal ethics accessible to anyone. Mathematical texts enabled commerce and construction. Legal formulas facilitated social order. If the goal was protecting scribal monopoly, why preserve and distribute so much practical knowledge? Why not focus on esoteric religious secrets only scribes could access? The alternative is that the Sumerians were sincere about their stated purpose. They were preserving transmitted knowledge because they genuinely believed civilization depended on it. The knowledge had been taught to them. Their responsibility was to maintain it accurately and pass it to the next generation. Enlil's role as Lord of the Bond between heaven and earth takes on practical meaning in this context. He wasn't just a mythological figure, he represented the principle of proper transmission, the authority that ensured divine instruction reached human practitioners, the force maintaining cosmic order by preserving the Gaza. This brings us to the most dramatic element of Enlil's teachings, the flood narrative and its aftermath. Multiple texts describe catastrophic deluge, but always in context of preservation and transmission. Someone receives instructions, someone survives, someone carries knowledge into the new world. The pattern reinforces the central theme. Civilization continues through proper transmission of received instruction, even across catastrophe. When the gods decided on destruction, the tablet, CBS 106M3, contains fragments of what scholars call the Eridu-Genesis, the oldest known flood narrative, predating the biblical account by more than a millennium. The text is damaged with significant gaps, but the surviving passages establish key themes that echo through every later version. The narrative begins with creation. The gods, An, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag, create the dark-headed people, the Sumerian term for humanity. Cities are established. Kingship descends from heaven. Civilization flourishes. Then humanity multiplies. The noise disturbs the gods. Enlil grows angry at the clamor rising from earth. He decides on destruction. A flood will sweep over the land, removing the disturbance. But Enki, Lord of wisdom and subterranean waters, opposes this decision. The text is fragmentary here, but later versions clarify what happens. Enki warns a favored human, Ziusudra in the Sumerian version, Atrahasis in the Akkadian, Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The warning comes indirectly. Enki speaks to a wall, knowing his chosen human overhears from the other side. The instructions are specific: tear down your house, build a boat, abandon possessions, save life, load the boat with seed of all living things, seal it with pitch, prepare for 7 days of storm. The Atrahasis version provides exact specifications. Make the boat cube-shaped. Let her length and breadth be equal. Roof her over like the Apsu. These aren't vague directions, they're technical specifications, dimensions, shape, construction techniques, waterproofing procedures. The level of detail suggests someone familiar with boat construction, providing instructions to someone who might not be. Ziusudra follows the instructions exactly. He builds the boat to specifications, loads it with seed, seals it with pitch. Then the storm comes. The description of the deluge is vivid across all versions. Overwhelming rain, rivers flooding, dikes breaking, the land becoming sea, even the gods terrified by what they've unleashed. The storm lasts 7 days, then silence, water receding. The boat grounds on a mountain. Ziusudra opens a window, sees dry land, makes sacrifice to the gods. Enlil discovers that humans survived. Initially angry that his decree was thwarted, he eventually relents. The Eridu-Genesis text becomes fragmentary here, but other versions describe Enlil blessing the survivors and establishing new order for the post-flood world. The Sumerian king list parallels this structure. It lists pre-flood kings with fantastical reign lengths. Then the flood swept over. Then, after the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. The narrative continues with historical kings and realistic reign lengths. This suggests the flood represented some kind of civilizational break in Sumerian memory. Whatever came before was different, described in mythological terms, impossible timeframes, legendary figures. What came after was historical, verifiable kings, realistic timeframes, archaeological confirmation. But the system continued across the break. Kingship descended from heaven both before and after the flood. Enlil conferred legitimacy in both periods. The Gaza remained the same. Knowledge was preserved through catastrophe by those who received proper instructions. This pattern, catastrophe, preservation through instruction, restoration of order, appears throughout Mesopotamian literature. It's the fundamental myth structure underlying Sumerian civilization's self-understanding. The flood wasn't a unique event in their view. It was the archetype of how civilization survives discontinuity. Knowledge must be preserved. Proper procedures must be followed. Transmission must continue even through catastrophe. Those who receive and maintain the instructions ensure civilization can be restored. Multiple texts, besides the flood narratives, reference earlier disasters and restorations. References to the time before the flood appear throughout Sumerian literature as if describing real historical period. Lists of antediluvian sages, the Apkallu, who brought knowledge to humanity before the deluge. References to knowledge preserved from that earlier time. The mainstream interpretation treats all this as mythology, perhaps cultural memory of actual flooding in Mesopotamian lowlands, transformed through retelling into universal deluge. Perhaps metaphor for cultural change and social reorganization. Perhaps foundation myth explaining civilizational discontinuities in the archaeological record. These interpretations have merit. The Mesopotamian plain did experience devastating floods. Civilization did go through periods of collapse and reconstitution. Myths do serve to explain historical discontinuities, but the alternative reading suggested by the texts themselves remains available. What if some kind of civilizational break actually occurred? What if knowledge was preserved across that break through deliberate transmission? What if the flood narrative encodes real memory of how civilization continued through catastrophe, not via gradual redevelopment, but through implementation of preserved instructions? This reading doesn't require believing in literal worldwide flood, but it does take seriously the Sumerian claim that their civilization represented restoration of something earlier, that their knowledge was received rather than developed, that the instructions attributed to Enlil and other Anunnaki came from before their current civilization and needed to be preserved exactly because they couldn't be recovered if lost. The Atrahasis epic makes this preservation function explicit. After the flood, Enki establishes new conditions for humanity: population control through disease, difficulty in childbirth, celibacy for some, but the fundamental instructions for civilization continue unchanged. How to organize cities, how to practice agriculture, how to maintain social order. The knowledge survives intact into the new world. Enlil's role in these narratives is complex. He decrees the destruction. His anger at human noise prompts the flood. Yet after the catastrophe, he blesses the survivors and re-establishes order. He's both destroyer and preserver, judge and restorer. This dual function makes sense within the Sumerian worldview. Enlil maintained cosmic order. Part of that function was eliminating disorder. If humanity disrupted cosmic harmony, Enlil's role required corrective action. But if humanity survived through proper instruction and preserved the Gaza, then Enlil's role required acknowledging that survival and re-establishing legitimate order. The flood narrative thus reinforces the central teaching: follow the instructions, preserve the knowledge, maintain the proper procedures. Do this and civilization survives even through catastrophe. Fail to do this and civilization collapses beyond recovery. This brings us to another category of Enlil's teachings, the creation accounts that describe humanity's origin and purpose. These texts provide context for why humans needed instruction in the first place. Created to labor, taught to build, the Eridu Genesis offers the Sumerian account of human creation, though the tablet is badly damaged and key passages are lost. What survives establishes that the gods, An, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag created humanity. The text then lists 5 antediluvian cities: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. At each city a king rules. Then the flood. But why were humans created? For what purpose? The Atrahasis epic, composed in Akkadian but drawing on earlier Sumerian sources, provides the answer. The narrative begins with the gods themselves performing agricultural labor. The Igigi gods, lesser deities, complain about the burden. They rebel against the Anunnaki, the senior gods. The Anunnaki meet in council to address the crisis. How can the necessary work of maintaining creation be accomplished without exhausting the gods? Enki proposes a solution: create humans to bear the labor. Fashion them from clay mixed with the flesh and blood of a slain god. Give them enough intelligence to perform complex work, but not enough to threaten divine order. Let humans tend the earth while gods rest. The council agrees. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, shapes the first humans from clay. The gods sacrifice Geshtu, a god with intelligence, mixing his blood and flesh into the clay. From this mixture, humans are formed. 7 males and 7 females, created to serve the gods by performing agricultural labor, maintaining irrigation systems, and offering worship. The text describes the result. Let the birth goddess create offspring. Let man bear the drudgery of the gods. This creation account frames humanity's origin in starkly functional terms. Humans weren't created for their own sake. They were created to serve a purpose, relieving the gods of physical labor while maintaining creation's infrastructure. But functional creation required instruction. Newly created beings with intelligence, but no experience needed teaching. How to farm, how to irrigate, how to build, how to organize. The knowledge had to be transmitted. Multiple texts describe this transmission period. References to the antediluvian Apkallu, the 7 sages who brought knowledge to early humans. These sages are described as sent by Enki to teach humanity the arts of civilization, building techniques, agricultural methods, religious rites, legal principles, writing itself. The Apkallu appear in later Mesopotamian tradition as legendary figures from before the flood who established civilization's foundations. Their knowledge was preserved through the flood and transmitted to the post-diluvian world through Ziusudra and his successors. Enlil's role in this system was establishing proper order and confirming legitimate authority. While Enki provided practical knowledge, how to do things, Enlil provided governance principles, how things should be organized. Enki taught technique, Enlil decreed structure. Together, the Anunnaki provided humans with complete civilization, both practical knowledge and organizational framework. This division of function appears throughout Sumerian literature. Enki is the god of wisdom, crafts, fresh water, and practical problem solving. He's the clever one, the teacher, the one who shares knowledge with humans. Enlil is the god of authority, judgment, cosmic order, and legitimate rule. He's the administrator, the lawgiver, the one who maintains proper structure. Humans need both. Technique without proper organization leads to chaos. Organization without practical knowledge leads to failure. The Sumerian texts present both as divine instruction, transmitted together, maintained together. The creation accounts thus explain why instruction was necessary. Humans were made to function within creation, but they needed to be taught how. The teaching wasn't optional. It was essential to humanity's purpose, and once taught, the instruction needed to be preserved exactly because humans couldn't rediscover it on their own. They had been created to follow instructions, not to develop civilizational principles from scratch. This is where the Sumerian self-understanding diverges sharply from modern assumptions about cultural evolution. We tend to think of civilization as something humans developed gradually through trial and error, building on accumulated experience, innovating solutions to practical problems. The Sumerians describe civilization as something they were taught to maintain. The mainstream interpretation reconciles this by treating the creation myths as theological justification for existing social order. Humans labor because that's their divinely appointed role. Humans follow traditional procedures because the gods taught them. Religious ideology, legitimizing social structures and cultural practices. But this interpretation must account for the specific nature of what was being transmitted, not vague moral principles, but detailed technical knowledge. Not general guidance, but specific procedures. The farmer's instructions, the mathematical tables, the architectural plans, the administrative formulas, the legal codes, all presented as received knowledge that must be preserved exactly. Why frame practical knowledge in theological terms if the knowledge was actually developed through human innovation? Why not celebrate human ingenuity? Why emphasize divine instruction rather than human achievement? The Sumerian answer appears consistent throughout their literature because the knowledge wasn't developed through human innovation, it was taught. Civilization was a gift that came with instructions. Humanity's role was to implement those instructions faithfully. Enlil's teachings, in this framework, were the organizational principles that made civilization possible. How to structure legitimate authority, how to maintain social order, how to ensure proper transmission of knowledge across generations, how to preserve civilization even through catastrophe. These weren't abstract philosophical concepts, they were practical governance principles that the Sumerians believed had been established at civilization's beginning and needed to be maintained exactly for civilization to continue functioning. Before examining what modern scholarship makes of these claims, we should note that similar patterns appear in other ancient cultures. The Sumerians weren't unique in claiming their civilization came through divine instruction. This raises questions about whether we're seeing cultural archetype or cultural memory. The pattern across waters. The Egyptian pharaoh claimed descent from Ra and ruled as living god. But before the pharaohs, according to Egyptian tradition, the gods themselves ruled Egypt. The Turin canon, a king list similar to the Sumerian king list, begins with divine rulers: Ptah, Ra, Shu, Geb, Osiris, Set, Horus, then demigods, then mortal pharaohs. The pattern mirrors Sumer, divine rule, transitions to human rule, but human authority derives from divine source. The Shabaka stone, inscribed during the 25th dynasty, but claiming to copy a much older text, describes creation by Ptah through divine word. Ptah speaks, and reality comes into being. The parallel to Enlil's creative decree is striking. Authority flows from divine word made permanent through writing. The pharaoh maintains this order by performing proper rituals and following established procedures. Egyptian wisdom literature parallels Sumerian instruction texts. The instructions of Ptah-hotep, dating to the Middle Kingdom but claiming to transmit teaching from the Old Kingdom, presents proper conduct through procedural advice. Do this, avoid that, follow these patterns. The format mirrors the instructions of Shuruppak. Egyptian scribal schools functioned similarly to Sumerian eduba. Students copied model text repeatedly, achieving competency through exact replication. Innovation wasn't encouraged. The goal was preserving traditional knowledge. Egyptian architecture followed strict canons of proportion maintained across centuries. Temple plans replicated ideal forms. The emphasis was on correctness, matching the divine pattern, not on innovation or individual expression. The parallel suggests similar worldview. Civilization understood as implementation of divine instruction, knowledge framed as transmitted tradition, authority derived from proper connection to divine source, human role as maintaining received order rather than creating new forms. Across the ocean, Mesoamerican cultures told similar stories. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, brought civilization to the ancestors. He taught agriculture, calendar systems, writing, astronomy. He established proper worship. Then he departed, promising eventual return. Indigenous kings ruled as his representatives, maintaining the order he established. The Aztec and Maya educational systems emphasized exact transmission of traditional knowledge. Scribes trained in specialized schools, learning complex hieroglyphic writing systems and astronomical calculations. The knowledge was presented as received tradition, not as human innovation. Inca civilization framed similar claims. Viracocha brought knowledge to humanity. The Sapa Inca ruled with divine authority, maintaining proper order according to established principles. The famous Inca road system, astronomical alignments, and sophisticated administration all followed patterns presented as divinely instructed. In India, the Vedas describe divine knowledge transmitted through rishi sages to humanity. The knowledge existed eternally, revealed at world's beginning, preserved through exact oral transmission requiring perfect memorization. The emphasis on preservation without alteration mirrors Sumerian approach. Chinese tradition attributes civilization's foundations to legendary culture, heroes, Fu Xi who taught writing, Shen Nong who taught agriculture, Huang Di who taught governance. Later emperors ruled with the mandate of heaven, conditional divine authority that could be withdrawn if proper order wasn't maintained. The pattern appears globally. Civilization framed as received knowledge, authority derived from divine source, human role as maintaining transmitted order, education focused on preservation rather than innovation. The mainstream interpretation sees this as universal human tendency to legitimize social structures through religious authority. Every culture develops institutions, then attributes them to divine origin to make them seem eternal and unchallengeable. The pattern is archetypal, a way human psychology works across cultures, not evidence of actual divine instruction. This explanation handles the cross-cultural similarity through psychological universals and common social functions. We should expect ancient cultures to frame authority claims similarly because they face similar challenges and human minds work similarly. But an alternative interpretation remains possible. What if the pattern appears globally because it reflects something real? What if multiple ancient cultures preserved memory of civilization emerging through instruction rather than gradual evolution? What if the emphasis on exact transmission across all these traditions suggests they were maintaining knowledge they genuinely believed they had received? This doesn't require accepting any specific religious claim as literally true, but it does raise questions about the standard narrative of civilizational development. If multiple independent cultures all claimed their civilization came through transmitted instruction, all developed similar preservation mechanisms, all emphasized exact replication over innovation, is it sufficient to explain this simply as religious legitimation? The alternative is that these cultures were accurately describing their experience. They received complex knowledge as fully developed systems. They implemented that knowledge according to instructions. They preserved it exactly because they couldn't regenerate it if lost. This raises uncomfortable questions. Received from whom? Instructed by what source? The traditional answer is gods, but that merely names the mystery without explaining it. Modern scholarship cannot accept literal divine instruction while remaining within scientific framework, but it must still account for how complex civilizations emerged so rapidly, with sophisticated knowledge systems already in place. The Sumerian case is most dramatic, full civilization appearing within centuries with minimal archaeological evidence of developmental stages. The tension between archaeological evidence and traditional narratives creates space for multiple interpretations. Before examining these competing interpretations directly, we should consolidate what the Sumerian texts actually claim about Enlil's teachings. What the mainstream cannot explain, the texts examined so far present consistent picture. Enlil held supreme authority among the active gods. He possessed the Tablet of Destinies. He decreed fates and determined legitimate order. He conferred kingship on chosen rulers. He maintained cosmic law. His temple at Nippur served as the axis where divine instruction met human implementation. The specific content of his teachings, as preserved across multiple texts, included political structure, kingship as descended institution requiring divine confirmation, proper procedures for conferring and maintaining legitimate authority, duties of kings toward subjects, gods, and cosmic order, mechanisms for transferring authority between rulers and cities, social organization, hierarchies of authority, proper behavior at different social levels, transmission of family wisdom, maintenance of traditional practices, respect for established procedures, agricultural knowledge, detailed technical procedures for successful farming in Mesopotamian environment, tool specifications, timing criteria, observational methods, storage techniques, knowledge preservation, scribal training systems, emphasis on exact replication, institutional mechanisms for maintaining textual tradition, methods for transmitting knowledge across generations, catastrophe, survival, instructions for preserving civilization through disasters, specific procedures for physical survival, mechanisms for maintaining knowledge, continuity, restoration protocols for post-catastrophe rebuilding. This knowledge wasn't presented as philosophical speculation or religious aspiration. It was presented as procedural instruction. Do this, organize that, follow these patterns. The tone throughout is administrative, the decrees of an authority establishing how things must function. Mainstream scholarship interprets this through several lenses. Mythological framework. The texts are religious literature using divine characters to explore human concerns. Enlil represents cosmic order personified. His teachings are cultural values and practical knowledge attributed to divine source for legitimation. The emphasis on divine instruction is standard ancient Near Eastern theology, political legitimation. The kingship ideology served ruling elites by making their authority seem divinely ordained and therefore unchallengeable. Priests at Nippur maintained this system because it gave them influence over political legitimacy. The entire structure functioned to preserve power hierarchies. Cultural conservatism, Sumerian civilization valued tradition over innovation. Their religious framework reflected and reinforced this conservatism. Attributing knowledge to divine instruction discouraged questioning or changing traditional practices. The system served cultural stability. Standard development. The Sumerians developed agriculture, writing, social organization, and governance systems through the same gradual process other cultures did. They then created theological framework attributing these innovations to divine teaching. The mythology is retrospective justification. These interpretations rest on solid academic ground. They explain the evidence without requiring supernatural causation. They parallel patterns found in other ancient cultures. They make sense given what we know about how religions function and how political power operates. But each interpretation faces specific challenges. The precision problem. If these are merely religious metaphors, why the extraordinary level of technical detail? The farmer's instructions provide specifications that would make sense in an actual farming manual but seem excessive for theological literature. Why specify hoe weight in exact units if you're just making a point about divine order? The consistency problem. Sumerian literature shows remarkable textual stability across centuries despite political fragmentation. Different city-states, often at war with each other, preserve the same literary traditions with minimal variation. This suggests something beyond political legitimation, some shared commitment to exact preservation that transcended political boundaries. The absence problem. What's conspicuously absent from Sumerian literature is any account of innovation or discovery. Other cultures celebrate their inventors and innovators. The Sumerians rarely mention how anything was developed. Instead, this is the way it has always been done. This seems odd if the goal is cultural glorification. The timing problem. The sophistication of Sumerian civilization appears so rapidly that it creates archaeological puzzles. Within a few centuries, we go from simple villages to complex urban centers with sophisticated administration, monumental architecture, and the world's first writing system. The texts claim this knowledge was received rather than developed. Why does the archaeological record seem to support rapid implementation rather than gradual evolution? The distribution problem. Similar claims about received knowledge appear in multiple ancient cultures with no evidence of contact. The pattern is global. If this is merely religious legitimation, why does it take such similar forms across independent civilizations? What universal human pattern generates this specific form of legitimation? These challenges don't falsify mainstream interpretations, but they do leave room for alternatives. One alternative accepts that the Sumerians were accurately describing their subjective experience while remaining agnostic about the ultimate source. Perhaps they did receive complex knowledge as complete systems. The question becomes, from whom or what? Alternative. Reading. 1. Encoded philosophy. Perhaps Enlil's teachings encode sophisticated philosophical principles about social organization, cosmic order, and knowledge transmission. The procedural format made abstract principles concrete and memorable. The emphasis on exact transmission preserved philosophical wisdom across generations. The divine framework provided powerful metaphors for understanding reality. This reading treats Sumerian religion as profound philosophy disguised as mythology. Enlil represents the principle of legitimate order. The Tablet of Destinies represents the concept that authority requires proper procedure. The Gaza represent the patterns that make civilization function. The entire system was wisdom tradition using religious language. This interpretation handles the sophistication and consistency of the texts. It explains the cross-cultural similarities through universal human philosophical concerns. It allows us to take the text seriously as containing important insights while not requiring literal divine instruction. The weakness of this reading is that the texts themselves resist it. They don't present philosophical principles metaphorically explored. They present specific procedures literally described. The farmer's instructions isn't a meditation on agricultural wisdom, it's a farming manual. The king list isn't a philosophical treatise on legitimacy, it's a chronicle of kings and dynasties. Alternative. Reading 2. Lost predecessor culture. Perhaps Sumerian civilization did receive knowledge from earlier source, not divine instruction, but transmission from a predecessor culture now lost to archaeology. This would explain the rapid emergence, the sophisticated knowledge, the emphasis on preservation rather than development. This reading proposes that Sumerian civilization didn't develop civilization from scratch. They inherited it from an earlier culture, possibly destroyed in some catastrophe, and preserved what they could. Their emphasis on exact transmission reflected genuine need to maintain knowledge they hadn't developed and couldn't replace. Enlil's teachings were the preserved wisdom from this earlier culture, attributed to divine source because their human origin had been forgotten. This interpretation handles many of the challenges. It explains the rapid emergence through inheritance rather than development. It explains the emphasis on preservation through genuine need. It explains the sophisticated knowledge as already developed inheritance. It even explains the flood narratives as possible cultural memory of the catastrophe that destroyed the predecessor culture. The weakness is lack of archaeological evidence. No clear predecessor culture has been identified that could account for Sumerian knowledge. The Ubaid period shows increasing complexity leading toward urban civilization, but doesn't clearly demonstrate the full sophistication the Sumerians claimed to inherit. The gap between Ubaid villages and Sumerian cities remains puzzling. Alternative. Reading 3. Preserved memory of actual instruction. Perhaps the texts mean what they say. Perhaps some kind of instruction actually occurred. Perhaps beings the Sumerians called Anunnaki, whatever those beings actually were, did provide knowledge to early humans about how to organize complex civilization. Perhaps Enlil represented real authority in this transmission. Perhaps the emphasis on exact preservation reflected genuine understanding that the knowledge was received and must be maintained. This reading takes Sumerian claims at face value while remaining agnostic about the nature of the Anunnaki. They needn't be gods in theological sense. They needn't be extraterrestrials. But they were some source of knowledge that taught early Sumerians how to organize civilization. Then those teachings were preserved exactly because the source couldn't be consulted again. This interpretation handles all the textual evidence cleanly. The Sumerians describe receiving instruction, Perhaps they did. They emphasize exact preservation. Perhaps they had good reason. They attribute knowledge to divine source. Perhaps that's the best description they could give for whatever actually taught. The weakness is that it requires something outside standard historical models. It posits a source of knowledge that archaeology hasn't identified and that doesn't fit comfortable explanations. It opens questions about who or what the Anunnaki were and what happened to them. It challenges the narrative of purely human cultural evolution. None of these interpretations can be definitively proven or eliminated based solely on the textual evidence. Each handles some aspects well while struggling with others. The question becomes, which interpretation fits the evidence most completely while making fewest additional assumptions? This is where individual judgment enters. After examining the tablets, the translations, the archaeological context, and the interpretive frameworks, each person must decide which explanation seems most probable. But before offering any conclusion, we should be clear about what the evidence actually demonstrates and what remains speculation. The tablets exist. The translations are reliable. The texts make specific claims about received knowledge and divine instruction. How we interpret those claims varies, but the claims themselves are historical fact. What happens when we sit with this evidence without rushing to comfortable explanations? What questions does it raise about the origin of civilization, the transmission of knowledge, and the nature of history itself? The question that remains. The tablet CBS 10673 weighs about the same as a modern paperback book. If you held it, you'd feel the density of fired clay, the texture of ancient craftsmanship, the weight of 4,000 years. The wedge-shaped marks pressed into its surface form words you can read, translated and published, accessible to anyone interested. Those words describe creation, early cities, and a flood that swept away the first world. They describe humanity created by gods, civilization established through divine ordinance, knowledge transmitted from heaven to earth. They describe specific procedures for agriculture, governance, social organization, instructions that the Sumerians claimed to receive rather than invent. Whether those claims describe literal truth, profound philosophy, cultural memory of lost predecessor civilization, or merely religious legitimation remains debatable. The evidence examined here doesn't force any particular conclusion. It opens questions rather than closing them. What we can say with confidence, the Sumerians believed they received civilization's foundations through instruction. This belief shaped how they organized society, educated scribes, transmitted knowledge, and understood their place in cosmic order. The belief was sincere, maintained consistently across centuries, reflected throughout their literature. The specific content attributed to Enlil's teaching, governance principles, agricultural techniques, preservation methods, shows sophisticated understanding of how to maintain complex civilization. Whether this knowledge was actually received from external source or developed internally, then attributed to divine teaching, it worked. Sumerian civilization endured for millennia, far longer than most political orders. The emphasis on exact preservation and proper transmission, while seeming overly conservative to modern eyes, successfully maintained cultural knowledge across political upheavals, environmental changes, and military conquests. The system proved resilient precisely because it valued preservation over innovation. The cross-cultural pattern of similar claims about received knowledge raises questions about human cultural development that haven't been fully answered. Why do independent civilizations frame their origins so similarly? Does this reflect universal human psychology, cultural archetype, or possible historical reality? The archaeological puzzles surrounding civilization's rapid emergence in multiple locations remain unresolved. The Sumerians are a dramatic case, but not unique. Complex knowledge systems appear with surprising speed in multiple ancient cultures. Standard models of gradual development don't completely account for this pattern. What remains unclear is the ultimate source of the knowledge. The Sumerians said it came from the Anunnaki, specifically from Enlil's decree. They described this in consistent, specific terms across hundreds of texts spanning more than 1,000 years. They created institutions specifically designed to preserve this transmitted knowledge exactly. Were they accurately describing real instruction from real source? Were they encoding profound philosophy in religious metaphors? Were they preserving genuine memory from lost predecessor culture? Were they simply legitimizing their own innovations through theological framework? The honest answer is, we don't know with certainty. What we do know is that their approach, viewing knowledge as received treasure requiring exact preservation rather than as evolving understanding subject to constant revision, allowed them to maintain civilization through periods that destroyed other cultures. The stability of Mesopotamian civilization, its continuity across dynastic changes, its influence on later cultures, all stemmed from this commitment to preserving transmitted tradition. Perhaps that itself is the teaching. Perhaps Enlil's wisdom wasn't primarily in the specific content, though that was sophisticated, but in the framework for preservation. Perhaps the instruction was, knowledge is precious, transmission is sacred, preservation matters more than innovation, and civilization depends on maintaining these principles across generations. If so, that's a teaching the modern world has largely forgotten. We value innovation over preservation. We celebrate disruption over continuity. We see rapid change as progress and tradition as obstacle. The Sumerian approach, cautious, conservative, emphasizing exact transmission, seems antiquated. Yet they created civilization that endured for millennia, while we struggle to maintain institutions for decades. The question that remains isn't just, did Enlil literally exist and give instruction? The deeper question is, were the Sumerians right about how civilization should be maintained, regardless of where their knowledge originated? That question each person must answer for themselves, informed by evidence, but ultimately based on how they understand the world. As you drift toward sleep, consider what it means that humanity's first civilization framed itself as receiver and preserver of knowledge rather than as inventor and innovator. Consider what we might have lost in modern assumption that all knowledge must be discovered rather than some being transmitted. Consider what hidden teachings might remain hidden, not because they're secret, but because we've stopped looking for them in the right way. The tablets sit in museums, translated and published, accessible to anyone who wishes to read them. The teachings attributed to Enlil are available. The question isn't whether they're hidden, but whether we recognize them for what they are. Whatever the source, divine instruction, profound philosophy, cultural memory, or human innovation attributed to gods, the Sumerian approach to knowledge, preservation, and cultural transmission worked. Perhaps that itself is the evidence we should consider most carefully. The clay tablet weighs heavy in the hand. The marks upon it form words. The words describe a world where knowledge descended from heaven, where instruction preceded implementation, where civilization was taught rather than discovered. Believe what you will about the literal truth, but consider what it means that this was how humanity began, claiming to learn rather than claiming to invent, seeking to preserve rather than seeking to change, maintaining tradition rather than embracing innovation. Perhaps Enlil's hidden teaching wasn't hidden at all. Perhaps it was spoken plainly. Receive, preserve, transmit, maintain what you've been given, honor the source, whatever it was. Keep the knowledge alive across generations. If that was the teaching, it succeeded. 4,000 years later, we can still read the tablets, understand the words, and consider the questions they raise. The answer: what you believe about where civilization came from and what knowledge we were meant to preserve is something only you can determine. Rest now with these questions. Let them settle gently as you drift away. Wherever you're listening from, whatever time it finds you, the tablets remain. The words endure. The teachings wait for whoever wishes to understand them. The evidence exists. The interpretations vary. The mystery remains. And perhaps that's exactly as it should be.